The Grand Hall of the Eternal Accord was built to make every species feel the weight of the galaxy. The ceiling stretched so high above the delegates that some of the smaller races needed vision enhancement to see the top, and the lights along the walls pulsed in 47 different colors, one for each civilization that held a recognized seat on the conclave floor. Every 10 years, the decennial summit brought them all together. Ambassadors and generals, scientists and diplomats, kings and elected officials, all gathered in one place to decide the shape of the known universe for the next decade. This year, the tension in the hall was sharper than usual, more personal, and most of that sharpness had a name. Princess Velithra, Sorn of the Aurelian Empire, stood at the center of the floor with the ease of someone who had never once in her life walked into a room and doubted that she owned it. She was tall even by Aurelian standards, golden-skinned, her ceremonial robes trailing behind her in long folds of silver and amber, and her eyes were the color of twin suns burning at midday. She had come to claim 3 star systems. The systems sat at the edge of what old conclave navigational maps, still labeled as human territorial space, a faded designation, a relic border from a civilization that had not existed in 300 years. 3 systems rich in resources, perfectly positioned for Aurelian expansion, and currently claimed by no living species. The problem was a procedural one. Humanity's territorial claims had never been formally dissolved, because humanity had never been formally declared extinct. They had simply vanished after the Siege of Sol, 300 years ago, when the Aurelian Empire and several allied fleets had descended on humanity's home system in a war that lasted 11 brutal months and ended with the star called Sol, surrounded by wreckage and silence. After that, nothing. No transmissions, no ships, no signals, just quiet. And 3 centuries of quiet had convinced most of the galaxy that quiet was the same as Gone Violithra's proposal was straightforward: issue a formal total extinction declaration for humanity, dissolve their territorial holdings, and transfer the 3 contested systems to Aurelian jurisdiction. Clean, legal, permanent. The vote was moments away, but Elder Moon was speaking. He was small and ancient, and from a species that did not measure age in years but in geological events, and his voice was dry and unhurried. He raised a procedural objection with the calm confidence of someone who had watched 3,000 years of politics and understood that the loudest voice in a room is rarely the most important one. The Reyes Convention requires a minimum 14-year active search period before a total extinction declaration can be filed, he said simply. That search was never conducted for humanity. Therefore, the motion is procedurally incomplete. Velithra turned, toward him slowly. Elder Moon, she said, her tone warm and precise. Humanity has not been detected in any form for 300 years. At what point does procedural patience become theater? The law does not differentiate between patience and theater, Moon replied. It only recognizes procedure followed and procedure ignored. There was a murmur across the chamber, delegates shifting, whispering, and exchanging glances, and Velithra let the room settle before she stepped forward and addressed the full floor. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The chamber gave her silence the way rooms give silence to people who have never had to ask for it. "We are gathered here to govern a living galaxy," she said, "not to write love letters to the dead. Humanity was a species of short-lived mammals who confused stubbornness with strength. They aged within a single century, they're bruised in standard planetary atmosphere and shattered under pressures that most species here consider mild. They were soft, and they were brief, and they were breakable in every way a species can be breakable. They walked into every conflict in this galaxy as though the stars owed them something, as though the universe would make an exception for creatures with enough heart, but not enough evolution. It did not, when something is that fragile. And the universe does not mourn it. It simply forgets it. So frail were they that even we, who ended them, stopped thinking about them within a generation. So frail that this chamber today needed a moment to remember that they ever existed at all. File the declaration. The dead do not object, and neither should we. The chamber laughed. Not politely, genuinely, a low, rolling sound that moved across 47 species like a wave, let each civilization finding its own version of amusement in the same joke. Even some of the oldest delegates allowed themselves a quiet smile. Vailithra returned to her position, and Counselor Zath, the six-armed Dravathi, who served as summit facilitator, called the formal vote to order. The motion for total species extinction declaration regarding Homo sapiens, the species commonly recorded as humanity, is now before the floor. Delegates in favor will register their signal. The tally board above the chamber floor began to fill, green lights blinking on one after another, each one a civilization casting its vote. Each one a small, quiet agreement that humanity was finished and the galaxy should move forward without them. Vailithra counted the lights as they appeared. 22, 27, 30. More than enough. The motion was going to carry by a wide margin, and she would have her systems before the summit's closing session. Then every alarm on the Eternal Accord fired at once, not a soft alert, not a routine proximity warning, but a full emergency cascade, and the kind that shook crew members out of whatever they were doing and sent them running to their stations. The kind of sound that only the detection grid produced when it encountered something it genuinely could not categorize. The chamber went silent instantly. The tally board froze. On the large display screen above the floor, the one normally used for star charts and treaty maps, a new contact appeared at the edge of long-range sensor range. It was a ship it had dropped out of, a faster-than-light travel at a distance that was clearly deliberate. Close enough to be impossible to ignore, far enough to avoid being interpreted as an attack, and it sat there between the Eternal Accord and the three contested star systems like a question nobody in the chamber had expected to be asked. It was enormous, 3 times the length of any warship in the Conclave fleet database, and it was old in a way that had nothing to do with elegance. Its hull was dark and deeply scarred, all covered in generations of repairs stacked on top of each other, welded plates over welded plates, patched sections and reinforced joints and seams that told the story of a vessel that had survived things that should have destroyed it and simply never stopped flying. The Conclave identification system ran its first scan. No match. Second scan. No match. Third scan. A flag. A partial hit. A reference to an archive so old the system needed several seconds to pull it up. Then the translation matrix rendered the writing on that old dark hull. UNS C. Lazarus. Last vessel of Earth fleet. Nobody in the chamber spoke. Vailithra stared at the screen, and for the first time in the session, she had nothing to say. The name on the hull sat on the display screen for a long time before anyone in the chamber found words for what they were feeling. UNS C. Lazarus, last vessel of Earth fleet. For most of the delegates, it was simply impossible. Not surprising, not alarming, but genuinely structurally impossible, the way 2 solid objects cannot occupy the same space. Humanity was gone, had been gone for 3 centuries. And the universe did not allow gone things to simply reappear at inconvenient moments, and yet the sensors did not lie. The ship was there, massive and silent and real, sitting in space between the Eternal Accord and the 3 star systems that had just been voted away. Counselor Zath called for a sensor diagnostic. The crew confirmed the readings were accurate. The contact was real. It was solid. And its mass signature was consistent with a vessel of extraordinary size. "Get me a tactical assessment," Vailithra said, and her voice was back to its usual smooth control, though something behind her eyes had changed. "I want to know what that ship is capable of, and I want 14 warships in formation around it within the next 3 minutes." The Aurelian naval attaché relayed the order and across the docking bays of the Eternal Accord. Aurelian crew members moved quickly to battle stations. 14 warships broke from their escort positions and began to fan out in a containment arc around the unknown vessel. They never completed the formation. Before the third Aurelian ship reached its assigned position, the communications array of the Eternal Accord activated on its own, not hacked, not forced, simply opened, and as though the system had been politely asked and had agreed, and a voice came through the main speakers of the chamber with perfect clarity. It was a human voice, not the way the word human existed in old archive recordings, not thin, not historical, not filtered through centuries of degraded signal, but clear and present and alive. He's speaking conclave standard with a slight accent that the translation matrix had never encountered before because it had been 300 years since anyone had needed to catalog it. Conclave vessel Eternal Accord, the voice said, calm, unhurried, carrying the particular quality of someone who was not afraid of the silence before or after their words. We have been monitoring your proceedings. We ask that you pause the current vote. A representative of humanity is present and wishes to address the conclave floor. The chamber erupted. Delegates were on their feet, shouting questions at each other and at the facilitator. Counselor Zoth was calling for order with 3 of his 6 arms while using the other 3 to manage incoming communications from every conclave vessel in the area, and Violethra stood at the center of it all with her jaw tight and her eyes fixed on the display screen where that old dark ship sat completely still. She raised her voice over the chaos, not loudly but precisely, and in the way that cuts through noise without competing with it. This is a provocation, possibly a false signal, possibly a non-human vessel using archived human identifiers to create a political disruption. I am ordering my fleet to surround and hold that contact until we can verify its origin. Counselor Zoth, I move that the vote proceed. Zoth looked deeply uncertain, but nodded and began to call the chamber back to order. Then the human voice came through the speakers again. Princess Violethra, it said, and the fact that it used her name and her title and addressed her specifically and directly made the chamber go quiet faster than any gavel could have. We have counted your 14 ships. We are not moving, and we want to offer you something to consider before your next order. Think carefully about what it means that we are here at all. Think about what it required. 300 years of silence, 300 years of watching, but 300 years of surviving in the dark without a single ally or a single word of recognition from this body. And then ask yourself whether a species that endured all of that is the kind of species your fleet should be moving toward without a conversation first. The Aurelian warships were now in position. 14 vessels in a tight containment arc, weapons systems powered, targeting grids active. The naval attaché confirmed weapons lock on the unknown vessel. Or tried to, sir, the attaché said, on her voice carefully neutral in the way voices get when they are hiding alarm. We do not have a lock. Targeting systems are active and fully functional, but we are receiving no target confirmation from any of the 14 vessels. Run a diagnostic, Violethra said. Already running. Systems are not malfunctioning. Targeting is fully operational. The contact simply does not register as a valid target. It is as though the ship is not there for the weapons, but is clearly there for everything, I guess. That statement settled over the chamber like cold water. 14 warships, among the most advanced vessels in the Aurelian fleet, could see the Lazarus with every passive sensor they carried, could measure its mass, its heat signature, its energy output, but could not get a weapons lock on it. Not jammed, not blocked by a signal scrambler, not hidden behind any technology the conclave had ever catalogued. Simply and precisely not targetable. As though someone had reached into the fire control systems of every Aurelian ship simultaneously and removed one very specific capability without touching anything else. It was a level of technical precision that nobody in the chamber had a framework for. Elder Moon, who had been silent since the alarms fired, spoke quietly from his seat. "In my 3,000 years," he said, "I have seen jamming technology, stealth plating, sensor spoofing, and signal disruption of every variety. What is being done to our fleet right now is none of those things. What is being done right now is something I do not have a name for." Several delegates looked at each other. Nobody had anything to add. Velithra stood very still for a moment, the kind of still that is not calm, but is the thing that comes before a decision. And then she walked to the communications console herself and activated the channel manually. "This is Princess Velithra Sorn of It's the Aurelian Empire," she said. "Identify your commander and state your intentions." The response came without delay. "Commander Alara Voss, UNSC Lazarus, representing the surviving population of humanity. Our intentions are simple. We heard you were voting to erase us. We came to vote no." A pause, short, clean, deliberate. Then, "We are requesting permission to dock one representative aboard the Eternal Accord, unarmed, alone, to address the conclave floor. If that request is denied, we will remain here for as long as it takes. We have nowhere else to be, and we are very patient. You may have noticed." Counselor Zath looked at Velithra. Velithra looked at the screen. The old dark ship sat in space and waited, still, massive, and completely unbothered by the 14 warships that surrounded it and could not touch it. She gave the order to grant docking clearance. She gave it quietly, without explanation. And she turned away from the console before anyone in the chamber could see her expression fully. The docking bay crew of the Eternal Accord prepared berth 7 in silence, moving with the precise efficiency of trained professionals who had collectively decided that asking questions right now was not something any of them wanted to do. Somewhere outside, against the dark between stars, the Lazarus adjusted its position with the slow patience of a ship that had been waiting 3 centuries for this moment and had no intention of rushing the last few minutes of it. Berth 7 locked into position. The docking tube extended at the end of it, an airlock waited, and on the other side of that airlock, humanity waited with it. The docking bay of the Eternal Accord was not built for ceremony. It was a functional space. The all-exposed machinery and magnetic floor clamps and the distant hum of pressurization systems. But it felt like ceremony when the airlock at the end of the Lazarus's docking tube finally opened. The delegates who had gathered along the upper observation rail, and there were many of them, because nobody in the chamber had wanted to stay in their seats, leaned forward as one person walked through. Commander Alara Voss was not what most of the delegates had imagined. They had imagined something harder, something built like a weapon, something that matched the reputation they were rapidly constructing in real time for a species that had survived 3 centuries in the dark and then appeared without warning at the most important political gathering in the galaxy. Alara Voss was of average height for a human, which made her shorter than most Aurelians and taller than several other species present. She had brown skin and dark hair pulled back from her face in a practical knot. And she was wearing a worn duty uniform that had been repaired in several places over many years. The fabric at her left shoulder was a slightly different shade than the rest, and the insignia on her chest had been re-sewn at least once. The only decoration she wore was a patch on her right arm, a small rectangle of fabric showing a blue planet against a black background Earth. She walked without escort through the docking bay. I passed the Aurelian security personnel who watched her with expressions that mixed suspicion with something quieter and harder to name, and she entered the main corridor of the Eternal Accord without asking for directions, which meant she already knew the layout of this ship, which meant she had been studying it, which was a thought that nobody in the observation rail allowed themselves to finish when she entered the conclave chamber. The delegates were already assembled. The room was not the same as it had been an hour ago. The casual energy of a routine vote had been replaced by something tenser and more careful. The way a room changes when everyone in it has suddenly remembered that they do not know everything. Velithra was at the center of the floor, standing, not seated, and she watched Alara walk in with eyes that gave nothing away. "Commander Voss," Velithra said, "you are present at the invitation of this body under temporary observation status. You have not been granted a recognized seat, as humanity's status is still formally under review. You may speak, but you hold no vote." "Understood," Alara said. She stopped at the center of the floor, not far from where Velithra stood, and looked around the chamber once, slowly, and as though she was reading it. Then she said, "I would like to use the display system, if the counselor will allow. I have a data packet I want to share with the floor." Zoth granted the request. Alara connected a small device to the chamber's display port, a device that looked old, scratched, clearly carried for a long time, and the main display screen came to life. What it showed was not a speech and not an argument. It was a record. 300 years of human history. The organized and documented and rendered in the visual language of conclave standard archival format, which told the delegates immediately that whoever had compiled this had studied conclave systems in detail, had understood how the conclave stored and processed information, and had deliberately presented their history in a form the conclave would find familiar and credible. The record began 11 months after the siege of Sol. 11 ships had escaped the destruction of the human home system, carrying approximately 40,000 survivors, adults, children, engineers, soldiers, farmers, doctors, teachers, and a collection of every seed bank, cultural archive, and technical database that could be loaded during 11 months of desperate preparation while a fleet closed in around their star. The 11 ships had not gone to any conclave member state for help, because they had calculated correctly that any state they approached would either turn them over to the Aurelian Empire to avoid a political dispute, or absorb them as a subject population with no rights and no future. So they went where no one followed them. The outer uncharted reaches, the deep dark at the edge of mapped space, the region that every conclave species had looked at and collectively decided was not worth the cost of colonizing. Too hostile, too resource-scarce, too far from trade routes, too cold and too quiet. For humanity, it was perfect. The record played through 300 years in a careful and precise summary. The first decade of survival in temporary habitats, cold and difficult and marked by losses that the record named individually. Every person who died in those first years had their name in the archive, not as a list, but as individual entries with details. And because the survivors had decided early that they would not let the dead become numbers. The second decade showed the first permanent settlement, a colony on a moon with barely breathable atmosphere that they had made breathable through 10 years of sustained terraforming work that no conclave species had ever managed on that scale in that time with those resources. The following decades showed expansion, slow at first, then accelerating, new colonies, and new ships built from asteroid-mined materials, new generations born into a humanity that had no home to return to and chose to build new ones instead of mourning. By the 200th year, the record showed 14 colony worlds, a combined population of over 400 million, and a fleet of vessels that shared nothing with the pre-siege human military except the names. Everything else had been redesigned, rebuilt, and improved by generations of engineers with no outside input and nothing but time and necessity and each other. By the time the record reached the present day, humanity numbered over 600 million people across 14 worlds, operating with technology the conclave had no data on, and a fleet the record deliberately did not show in full. The chamber was silent throughout. When the display went dark, the silence stayed. Velithra spoke first. Her voice was still controlled, But something in it had changed in a small way that the delegates closest to her could hear. This record is unverified. It could be fabricated. 14 colonies and 600 million people do not appear in the deep dark without anyone detecting them. No one was looking, Ilara said, simply without heat. You declared us dead and stopped looking. We noticed. Your stealth technology, your weapon systems. All of this represents a significant security concern for every member state here. You have been conducting surveillance on conclave space for 300 years without authorization. Ilara looked at her steadily. You voted to erase us today, she said. We watched you do it, and before that, for 300 years, we watched this body never once ask whether we survived, and never once send a single ship into the dark to check. You did not look for us. We watched you not look for us. If that makes you uncomfortable, I understand. But I want you to consider which of us in this room has more reason to feel unsafe right now. The chamber did not make a sound. Velithra held Ilara's gaze for a long moment. Then, very precisely and very deliberately, she said, humanity's claim to a conclave seat expired with their civilization. You are asking this body to recognize a new entity that has never been vetted, never been evaluated, and has just revealed itself to be operating in secret with unknown military capabilities. The answer is no. Ilara nodded slowly, as though she had expected this, and as though she had prepared for it. And she said, Then I suppose we move to the next step. Nobody asked what the next step was, but everyone in the chamber felt it coming. The way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm arrives, before the sky has shown you a single cloud. Something was shifting, and everyone in the room could sense it, and nobody could stop it. Ilara Voss reached into her uniform pocket and stood quietly at the center of the floor. 47 civilizations watched her and waited. Nobody asked what the next step was. They found out within the hour Velithra had used the recess after the session to confer with her military advisors, her political staff, and the 3 Aurelian admirals who were aboard the Eternal Accord as part of the standard diplomatic security arrangement. And when the chamber reconvened, she walked to the floor with the particular walk of someone who had made a decision and was completely done reconsidering it. I am invoking the Aurelian right of challenge, she said. The room reacted immediately, not with panic, but with a sharp collective intake of breath. What the sound of 47 civilizations recognizing a significant moment. The right of challenge was an old provision, older than most of the current conclave member states, originally written into the charter to resolve territorial disputes between species who could not reach agreement through negotiation. It was rarely invoked because it was blunt and final and irreversible. The challenging party named a military contest. The terms were set, and the conclave was bound to honor the result. Velithra laid out the terms without hesitation. The Aurelian fleet against whatever military force humanity could field, the 3 contested star systems as the prize, winner take all, decided in open space, observed by conclave monitors. The logic was clean, and she knew it. The Aurelian Empire operated one of the 3 largest military forces in the known galaxy. Hundreds of warships, battle-proven crews, technology developed over centuries of active conflict. Humanity had 14 colonies that had existed in secret and 1 very old ship that had shown up at a political meeting. Even if they had more ships hidden somewhere, the numbers could not favor them. She would defeat them in open engagement, and the conclave would be legally bound to recognize the result. No more debate, no more archives, no more uncomfortable questions. Just a clean and final answer written in the language of force, which was the only language that had ever settled questions like this one, permanently. Counselor Zoth confirmed the invocation was procedurally valid. He looked at Ilara Voss and formally asked for humanity's response. Ilara was quiet for several seconds, not hesitant, but still, and in the way someone gets still when they are choosing their words very carefully. and then she said, "Accepted." She pulled the small communications device from her uniform pocket and sent a single transmission back to the Lazarus. One word, short and plain. I spoken in English so that the translation matrix rendered it for the chamber a half-second after she said it. Amaranth. Nobody in the room knew what it meant. The matrix identified it as an English word for a plant that does not wilt. But the way Alara said it, flat and quiet and final, it sent something cold through the air of the chamber that several delegates would describe the same way afterward, like a door closing very softly in a large, empty house. Then she sat down and she waited. Valithra deployed her fleet within the hour. 200 Aurelian warships pulled from escort and support positions across the entire region. They organized into 4 combat groups and sent toward the 3 contested systems. It was a show of force that the conclave had not witnessed at close range in decades, and several smaller nations' delegates watched the deployment with visible discomfort, reminded of just how large the Aurelian military truly was when it decided to move. The fleet pushed out into open space, and the chamber watched on the tactical display. For the first 2 hours, nothing happened. The lead combat group reached the outer boundary of the first contested system and found empty space. No ships, no stations, no defensive platforms, no signals of any kind. They pushed deeper into the system and found the same. Empty, quiet, and completely undefended, Valithra allowed herself a small and precise expression of satisfaction. Then the second combat group lost contact with 3 of its vessels, not destroyed. Their transponder signals were still broadcasting and their life support systems were still active, but they had stopped responding to fleet communications and their reported positions no longer matched their last known course. They had been moved somehow, without the rest of the fleet detecting any engagement at all. The third combat group moved to investigate and immediately encountered the same problem. Ships dropping out of coordinated formation without warning, their navigation somehow redirected, appearing at wrong coordinates minutes later with confused crews who could report no memory of any attack because there had been no attack, just a sudden, precise change in where they were. Within the following 2 hours, the situation deteriorated in ways that the Aurelian admirals would spend years trying to explain in their official reports. Human ships appeared everywhere and nowhere, emerging from faster-than-light travel at precise intervals, never in the same position twice. They always at the exact angle and distance that fractured Aurelian formation cohesion without triggering a direct confrontation. Every time an Aurelian group adapted their formation in response, the human ships had already repositioned to counter the adaptation. It was as though someone had pre-mapped every possible Aurelian tactical decision and placed a precise answer for each one before the engagement ever started, which, as it became undeniably clear, was exactly what had happened. Humanity had spent 300 years studying Aurelian military doctrine. The same doctrine the Aurelian fleet had not meaningfully changed in over a century, because it had never needed to. Because it worked against every other species. But it had never been tested against a civilization that had watched every Aurelian engagement on record and built their entire approach to warfare around defeating that one specific doctrine with extreme precision and zero margin for error. Not a battle, a trap. Built 300 years ago and patient enough to wait for the day it would be needed. No Aurelian ship was destroyed. No crew member was killed. No weapon was discharged in anger. The human fleet moved 200 warships the way water moves around stone, with total efficiency and total calm, herding the most powerful force in the region with the quiet confidence of a species that had decided, long ago, and that the most dangerous thing it could demonstrate was not the ability to destroy, but the ability to win completely without giving anyone a reason to call it a massacre. The chamber watched the tactical display in silence. Position after position collapsed, formation after formation dissolved, and the Aurelian fleet, which had arrived with overwhelming numbers and absolute certainty, found itself being guided rather than fighting, redirected rather than resisted. I now thought so completely and so far in advance that resistance felt less like a choice and more like a performance. Vilethra stood at the display for a long time without speaking. When the last Aurelian combat group found itself redirected into a holding position with no viable path of engagement and a loose ring of human ships sitting at comfortable distances in every direction, a transmission came through to the Eternal Accord addressed to Vilethra directly. It was Ilara's voice, and it was calm, and it carried no triumph in it. Only something that sounded like the particular tiredness of people who have been carrying something heavy for a very long time and have finally been allowed to set it down. No ships destroyed, no lives taken. Every member of your fleet will return home to their families. We made that choice deliberately, Your Highness. Not because we could not do otherwise, but because we understand, better than most, what the alternative costs. We have buried every person we have ever lost, and we remember every single name. We did not want to add yours to our list. We want our seat. We want our systems back. And we want, from you personally, on the floor of this chamber, an apology, not for the siege that happened before anyone alive today was born, but for what you said on that floor this morning, because we were listening when you said it. And so was every human alive across 14 worlds. They deserve to hear it corrected. And so, frankly, does the record. The transmission ended. In the chamber, nobody moved. Vilethra stood with her hands at her sides and her eyes on the display, and the display showed her fleet sitting still in space, patient and waiting, going nowhere. The political consequences of the next 3 weeks moved faster than anyone had predicted, and in a body as large and slow as the Galactic Conclave, and fast movement was itself a statement about how deeply the arrival of the Lazarus had unsettled the established order. The first formal action came from an unlikely source, not from one of the major powers, not from a species with obvious political reasons, but from Elder Moon, who submitted a revised procedural motion the morning after the right of challenge was decided. His motion was simple: withdraw the Extinction Declaration vote in its entirety, and on the grounds that it had been based on a false premise, formally recognize that humanity had never legally met the definition of an extinct species, since survival of any population constituted continued existence, and initiate the reintegration charter, a provision so old that most of the conclave's current legal staff had to search 3 levels of archived legislation to find it. Unwritten for the theoretical scenario of a species returning to recognized status after a long period of diaspora or absence, no one had ever used the reintegration charter before. No species had ever needed it. The motion passed, not unanimously, but by a significant margin, and several delegates who had voted green on the Extinction Declaration reversed their position with the quiet efficiency of people who had decided that being on the wrong side of history was not a label they wanted permanently attached to their name, the human seat on the conclave floor, empty for 300 years, kept as a formality and a footnote, and, to a very few, a quiet and uncomfortable reminder of what the siege had actually cost, was formally restored. A crew of conclave maintenance workers removed the old placard that had read "Humanity, Status, Absent," and replaced it with a new one, and the delegate from Elder Moon's office who supervised the replacement told 3 different people the same story afterward, that when the new placard was set in place, she had felt something in the room shift. The way a room shifts when a window is opened and fresh air comes in for the first time in a long time, the new placard read in conclave standard and in English, "Reserved." We simply had not returned yet. The 3 contested star systems remained in human hands. The right of challenge had settled that question in the clearest possible terms, and Vilethra's expansion proposal was formally closed without further debate. The Aurelian Empire did not collapse over this, Empires do not collapse, but over a single loss, even a public and humbling one. But Vaelithra's standing within the imperial court shifted in the weeks that followed, and the three admirals whose fleets had been redirected across empty star systems like confused traffic submitted quiet retirement requests that were quietly accepted. Vaelithra herself requested a closed, for private audience with Ilara Voss. Before the summit concluded, Ilara agreed. The meeting was held in a small conference room on a lower deck of the Eternal Accord. No recording devices, no staff, no witnesses beyond a single conclave observer required by protocol who was asked to stand outside the door. What happened inside that room was never officially recorded. The conclave observer, but when asked years later by a historian who had spent 2 decades trying to reconstruct the events of the summit, said only this: "I heard one voice speaking for a long time, and then I heard silence, and then I heard one sentence from the other voice, and then there was more silence, and then the door opened. When Vaelithra walked out, something in her bearing had changed. It was small, almost invisible. But people who knew her well would comment on it in the days that followed. A slight softening around the jaw, a less rigid angle to her shoulders. The particular look of someone who has put down something they had been carrying for a long time without realizing how heavy it was. She returned to the conclave floor for the summit's closing session and made a statement that was short and formal and wasted no words. She acknowledged that the characterization of humanity she had offered on the floor 2 weeks prior was inaccurate, and she withdrew it from the official record. She did not offer explanation or context, and she did not invite questions. She said what she had come to say, and she sat down. It was not a grand moment. It was quiet and contained. But the chamber heard it, and the chamber's long-range communication systems carried it outward, and every human colony world received a transcript of it within the week. And in homes and schools and gathering halls across 14 worlds, people read those words in different ways, some with deep satisfaction, and some with a more complicated feeling they could not easily name, some simply with the flat recognition of people who had always known the truth and were glad the official record would now finally reflect it. Ilara Voss did not stay for the closing ceremony. She had done what she came to do, and the diplomats and administrators who had spent years preparing for this moment. People who had grown up in the colonies knowing this day might one day come, who had studied conclave law and political structure and the 47 languages of the member states, and the 1,000 small details of how the galaxy's governing body actually worked, were ready to take the human seat and fill it properly. They were not footnotes. They were not a cautionary tale. They were 600 million people with 14 worlds and 300 years of history that had never stopped being written just because nobody was watching. Ilara walked back through the corridors of the Eternal Accord toward the docking bay, and Elder Moon found her there, standing near the airlock of the Lazarus's docking tube, looking at the old vessel the way you look at something you have been part of for so long that you no longer fully separate yourself from it. He stood beside her, and they were quiet together for a moment. "I voted against the declaration," he said. "I want you to know that." Ilara looked at him. Not with warmth and not with coldness, but with something direct and clear. "I know," she said. "We have records of every vote." The old archivist was quiet for a moment after that, sitting with the full weight of what that meant, that they had been watching carefully for a very long time, and that the conclave's small moments of decency had been recorded alongside everything else. That someone had been keeping score not out of bitterness, but out of the careful habit of a people who had learned that details matter, and that history belongs to those who bother to write it down. "We should have looked for you," he said, and it was the most honest thing anyone in the conclave had said since the Lazarus appeared. "Yes," Ilara said, and that was all. She walked through the airlock. The Lazarus undocked from the Eternal Accord without fanfare. No ceremony, no formal departure signal, no escort. It simply separated from the vessel and moved out into open space with the steady and unhurried momentum of something that had been moving for 300 years and did not need anyone's permission to continue. Delegates who were watching the docking bay feed saw it go. And several of them sat with that image for a long time. The image of that old, dark, scarred ship, pulling away from the lights and the politics and the careful language of the conclave and heading back toward the dark, it knew better than any of them. Not retreating, returning. There was a difference, and most of them understood it. The Lazarus grew smaller on the screens, and then smaller still. And then it reached the safe distance for faster-than-light travel, and the stars bent around it for one long and strange moment, and then it was gone. The Eternal Accord's sensors tracked the jump heading for 17 minutes before losing the signature in the deep dark. Nobody in the conclave knew exactly where humanity's worlds were. The coordinates had not been offered, and the conclave had not yet asked. And perhaps that was the right order of things for now. Trust was not something that 300 years of silence and one extraordinary week could fully repair. It was something that would be built slowly in the small, careful work of shared governance and kept promises and time that actually passes instead of just being waded through. But the seat was restored, and the name was no longer a footnote. And somewhere in the deep dark between stars, 600 million people received word that the galaxy had, at last, remembered they were there. They had known all along. They had simply been waiting for the galaxy to catch up. End.